In recent months, Donald Trump's rhetoric has taken a striking and unsettling turn, with pointed references to an enemy within that he claims is more dangerous than adversaries like Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, or even international terrorist organizations. Rather than direct threats against foreign powers, Trump has doubled down on targeting Americans he views as opponents, including journalists, certain Democratic politicians, and others who criticize his actions or ideas. At the heart of Trump's language is an increasingly disturbing suggestion that he may be willing to use military force to silence those he perceives as enemies. But what does this mean for American democracy, and how realistic is this threat? In this video, we'll explore the evolution of Trump's language and his troubling threats against journalists and politicians, dissect what this could mean if he were to regain power, and reflect on the broader implications of weaponizing the military against civilian enemies. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We're on the road to reaching 5,000 subscribers, but we can't do it without you. So, if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe right now. And if you're already subscribed, give this video a thumbs up and leave a comment to let me know your thoughts. Alright, let's dive right into it. Section 1. Trump's escalating rhetoric. From his 2016 campaign to his recent public appearances, Trump's language has always been marked by a brazen disregard for political convention. However, his more recent statements, hinting at military action against domestic enemies, signal an unprecedented escalation. This section will detail the recent history of his remarks, tracing their origins, and evaluating the implications of these claims. Background on the enemy within. The phrase enemy within isn't new, but Trump's recent use of it has been particularly pointed. In his speeches, he's used the term to describe Americans rather than foreign actors. The individuals he names, such as Representative Adam Schiff, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, and several prominent journalists, are well-known critics. By painting them as enemies comparable to dictators and terrorists, Trump isn't just targeting dissenting voices. He's sowing division, building an us versus them narrative that pits his supporters against his detractors in a very literal way. In this section, we'll analyze key excerpts from recent Trump speeches and public statements, showing his evolution from heated, partisan rhetoric to outright threats. Section 2. Journalists as the enemy of the people. The notion of the press as an enemy has been a staple in Trump's rhetoric since he took office, but his latest statements take the hostility further. Trump has revived the phrase enemy of the people in recent rallies, adding that the media poses an internal threat to America's well-being. He's implied that the military could deal with this threat, an idea that directly challenges democratic principles and the essential role of the free press. The role of the press in a democracy. Historically, the press has been considered the fourth estate in American democracy, a critical check on power that informs the public and holds leaders accountable. By undermining the media's credibility and painting it as a threat, Trump is attempting to weaken this vital pillar of democracy. This section will explore the dangers of labeling the press as the enemy and examine how this rhetoric has incited threats and violence against journalists. A new level of threat, calling for military intervention? Trump's language has gone beyond verbal criticism. By suggesting that the military could target enemy journalists, he implies a level of hostility that we rarely, if ever, see in democratic societies. This section will discuss how such language echoes tactics used in authoritarian regimes and consider the potential for real-world violence if this type of rhetoric continues unchecked. Section 3. Political opponents as the enemy. In addition to attacking journalists, Trump's enemy within narrative has extended to his political opponents. Figures like Adam Schiff and Nancy Pelosi are frequent targets, with Trump portraying them as traitors undermining America. The rhetoric goes beyond traditional partisan attacks, raising the specter of military action as a solution to domestic political disputes. The consequences of demonizing political opponents. This section will discuss how, in a democratic society, labeling political opponents as enemies rather than competitors erodes civil discourse and contributes to extremism. We'll also delve into how Trump's attacks on Democratic leaders specifically aim to rally his base, fostering a sense of urgency and mistrust that can destabilize governance. Legal and ethical limits on using the military against civilians. If Trump were to attempt military action against political opponents, what legal and constitutional limits would prevent it? Here, we'll examine the legality of such an action and outline the legal checks that prevent the military from targeting civilians in a political context, underscoring the boundaries that separate democracy from dictatorship. Section 4. Trump's audience and their reaction. In his recent rallies, Trump has continued to stir up fervor among his supporters, casting himself as a protector against these enemies. His base's reaction to his anti-media and anti-Democrat messaging has been overwhelmingly supportive, with crowds frequently cheering on his most extreme statements. How Trump's rhetoric resonates with his supporters. We'll examine the psychological and social reasons why Trump's rhetoric resonates so deeply with his audience, analyzing the appeal of us versus them language in creating group loyalty and solidarity. This section will draw from social psychology research on group dynamics and authoritarianism to explain why this divisive language is so effective. The risks of taking rhetoric literally. Trump's supporters may not view his language as hyperbole. Some may interpret his words as a direct call to action, resulting in violent acts against the individuals and groups he targets. We'll look at real-world examples where Trump's rhetoric has incited violence and consider the dangers of blurring the line between political speech and literal threats. Section 5. The Authoritarian Playbook. Trump's recent comments draw stark comparisons to the tactics used by authoritarian leaders worldwide. Leaders in countries like Turkey, Russia, and Hungary have similarly labeled journalists and political opponents as threats to national security, using such language to justify arrests, harassment, and worse. By studying these historical parallels, we can better understand the potential consequences of Trump's escalating rhetoric. Authoritarianism and the suppression of the press. This section will provide historical context on how authoritarian leaders worldwide have suppressed dissenting voices, drawing direct comparisons to Trump's language and behavior. We'll discuss how suppressing the press and targeting political opponents have been used historically to consolidate power, creating a blueprint that appears alarmingly similar to Trump's actions. What could happen in the U.S.? If Trump's rhetoric is allowed to persist unchallenged, what could this mean for American society? We'll outline the potential trajectory of escalating authoritarianism, discussing the short and long-term effects of suppressing freedom of speech and undermining democratic institutions. Trump's threats to use military force against his perceived enemies are far more than empty rhetoric. They represent a direct challenge to the values upon which American democracy is built, threatening the freedom of the press, the right to political opposition, and the very stability of the country. In the end, this isn't just about Trump. It's about a vision for America's future and whether it will be one rooted in the democratic values of tolerance, free speech, and respect for civil rights, or one that allows the whims of a single leader to dominate. The onus now falls on the American public and political leaders alike to push back against these threats. Trump's rhetoric, if left unchecked, could bring the country to a dangerous tipping point where the divide between opposing factions turns from ideological to violent. The time for decisive action is now, whether through advocacy, voting, or other means, to ensure that the principles of democracy are protected from this escalating threat.